Today is May 27, 2025. The conflict in Ukraine has reached another critical juncture. We are seeing an escalation on the part of the US, but it is doing this in a very indirect way. It is laundering its escalation through Europe, through Ukraine, as it tries to at least publicly distance itself from this conflict. This is all part of a pivot to China. It sees China as a more urgent threat. It wants to focus its resources on China. It wants Europe to invest more in its proxy war on Russia in Ukraine. And most importantly, it desperately wants to freeze this conflict and come around back to it later. So I'm going to use these two terms often. It is about a division of labor between the US and its European proxies. And this is about strategic sequencing. It's about freezing this conflict, focusing on China first, and then coming back and dealing with Russia later. This is exactly what the US did with Syria. It was a successful strategy. The US successfully overthrew the Syrian government late last year, and they hope to repeat the success regarding its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So I want to talk about the recent signs of escalation. First is this article from Politico. This was just yesterday, May 26, 2025. Merz lifts range limits on Ukraine weapons to hit targets inside Russia. Germany is under pressure to supply Ukraine with its powerful long-range Taurus cruise missiles. These are two decisions that only the United States can make. The United States will make this decision, and Germany will follow suit. And if you've been following my work or that of the Duran, Alex and Alexander at the Duran, or Scott of Calibrated, we have all talked about the Taurus air-launched cruise missiles and how if there is any way at all of sending them to Ukraine, they will be sent. There will be a constant escalation until it is physically impossible to escalate any further. This article says Germany and its key allies, as if Germany is the leader now, have lifted range restrictions on weapons sent to Ukraine, allowing Kiev to hit targets inside Russia with no external limits. There are no more range limitations for weapons delivered to Ukraine, neither from the Brits, nor the French, nor from us. He's talking about Germany, not from the Americans either, Merz said. Of course, Germany isn't going to make this decision for the United States or talk about it on behalf of the United States unless the US told them to. And so again, this is the US posing as a mediator in its own proxy war on Russia and laundering escalation through Europe and Ukraine. There were also these posts on social media, first from Keith Kellogg, who is a special envoy for the Trump administration, supposedly as part of these alleged peace negotiations with Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. And this is what he has said very recently. This is Kiev. The indiscriminate killing of women and children at night in their homes is a clear violation of the 1977 Geneva Peace Protocols designated to protect innocents. These attacks are shameful. Stop the killing. Ceasefire now. This is exactly what the US has done all throughout recent history. When a nation is ignoring US demands, they fabricate claims of human rights abuses, atrocities, trying to corner them politically and diplomatically to agree to whatever it is that they're demanding. In this case, again, I'll show you a ceasefire. They desperately want Russia to agree to a ceasefire. The United States has already instructed Europe to prepare forces to enter into Ukraine. They want to create a Minsk 3.0 framework and a Syria-style buffer zone in Ukraine. They want to freeze this and stop this conflict so that the US can focus on China. Division of labor, strategic sequencing. And then we have this from President Donald Trump himself. I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He has gone absolutely crazy. He is needlessly killing a lot of people. And I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it. And maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. Likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it. And it better stop. This is a war that would never have started if I were president. This is Zelensky's, Putin's, and Biden's war, not Trump's. I'm only helping to put out the big and ugly fires that have been started through gross incompetence and hatred. Except that is completely untrue. President Donald Trump in his previous administration eagerly participated in the lead up to this war. His administration was the first to officially, openly, publicly arm Ukraine. He armed them with anti-tank Javelin missiles, and he still to this day brags about doing that. We have to remember what actually led up to the 2022 special military operation, Russia's military incursion into Ukraine. The US violently overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014, and that was after years and years of US political interference, not just inside Ukraine, but across all of Eastern Europe. And we know that because the Western media admits that. This is from all the way back in 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So they, as far back as 2004, they were trying to overthrow the government, creates Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. And they spent billions of dollars doing this. It didn't succeed in 2004, but as they admit in this article, they also carried out regime change in Serbia and in Georgia in 2003. They also attempted it in Belarus. And they continued interfering in Ukraine until 2014, they were finally successful. From 2014 onward, again, the Western media admits all of this. The CIA took over all of Ukraine's intelligence agencies, reorganized them, and directed them to pursue US objectives. The spy war, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin. This did not begin with Russia's incursion into Ukraine in 2022 for more than a decade. And this includes all throughout President Trump's first administration. This was published in 2024. For more than a decade, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. And if you go through this article, they talk about US CIA bases built all along Russia's border in Ukraine, the creation of military units within Ukrainian intelligence to carry out covert operations, killing Russians in Russian-held territory like Crimea, and even within Russia itself. When you hear about Ukrainian intelligence carrying out assassinations inside Russia, killing military officers, killing journalists, that is the CIA created teams carrying this out. It's all admitted in the New York Times article. They created these units, and these are the units carrying out these operations. And there's this more recent article, this was published in 2025, also from the New York Times. The Partnership, the secret history of the war in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. And if you go through this article, it admits that Ukraine isn't fighting Russia at all. The US is fighting Russia through Ukraine. There's a command center in Germany. US generals direct absolutely everything from large offensives in 2022 and 2023 to picking out specific targets on the battlefield using Western transferred weapons to Ukraine to target and destroy. And these targets, and that means both inside Russian-held territory, but also inside indisputably Russian territory. This is a US war being fought against Russia using Ukraine as intermediaries. Also, a lot of this is being laundered through Europe, and now much more so than ever as the US seeks to pivot to China, freeze this conflict and pivot to China. They want Europe to take a bigger role in all of this. They need to prepare the European public to give up the use of public money being spent on them. They need to prepare them for that, because this public money is going to be transferred to arms and ammunition production, which is going to be used to freeze this conflict, or at least create some sort of stalemate, giving the US time to focus on China before it circles back around. Division of labor, strategic sequencing. When I talk about division of labor and strategic sequencing, I'm talking specifically about this directive US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, under the Trump administration, delivered to Europe on February 12, 2025. Earlier this year, he laid this plan out for a division of labor and strategic sequencing. Where did this idea come from? They come from policy papers published years before Trump ever came into office. The first one I want to show you is this from the Marathon Initiative. It's another one of these corporate financier-funded policy think tanks that actually drive US foreign and domestic policy, not Congress, not the White House. And it's titled Strategic Sequencing Revisited, and it was published in 2024, but it's about a policy paper published earlier in 2020. And I want to read this introduction to you. The United States faces a growing risk of a multi-front war against Russia, China, and Iran. The optimal response to this danger would be a sequential strategy aimed at inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia and Ukraine on a faster timeline than China's prepared to move against Taiwan. But for that strategy to work, the United States must use the current window wisely to shore up the situation in Eastern Europe, broker a more effective division of labor with allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and reform U.S. defense industrial base. And these are all of the things U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said since taking his position within the Trump administration. That is his agenda, to implement this policy paper and all of the other policy papers describing this strategy. So let's go to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's February 12, 2025 directive. This is a year after this policy paper was published. He says, "We face a competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific." The Indo-Pacific is on the other side of the planet from the US. So what Secretary Hegseth is talking about, what the Trump administration, the Biden administration, Obama, Bush, so on and so forth, what they're talking about is containing China in Asia so the US can continue helping itself to Asia, maintain its primacy over Asia despite being located on the other side of the planet. He also says, as the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, he's talking about China, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. It's almost verbatim what was laid out in the 2024 West Mitchell paper from the Marathon Initiative. He also said, again, this is Secretary Hegseth in February this year, talking about Europe, donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, exactly what West Mitchell said in that 2024 paper. And importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. That's what this is about. The US is still directing the proxy war against Russia, but it needs Europe to take more public spending away from the European people and put it into its proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And so they need to convince the European people that there is some sort of threat facing them from Russia to justify transferring public spending from Europeans in Europe to this US proxy war. That is what this is about. That is what the Trump administration came into office planning to do. Not make peace, but to continue this war and to wring Europe further for support for this so that they can focus more on China. Division of labor, strategic sequencing. And challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourself not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals. Does that sound like a Trump administration seeking any sort of peace with Russia in Ukraine? The answer is no. And then this part is very important. Again, this is Secretary Hegseth delivering his directive to Europe February earlier this year. Security guarantee. Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. No American troops, European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. So that is not ending the conflict, that is freezing it. So this is the actual plan. They want to continue it as it is at worst, and at best they would like to freeze it and come back to it, just like they did with Syria. That was a proxy war the US waged against Syria from 2011 to 2024. And they had to freeze the conflict because they were losing. They froze the conflict. They hollowed out the Syrian army, economy, government. Then they overextended Syria's allies, Russia and Iran, and by 2024, everything collapsed and they won. The US won. They overthrew the government of Syria, just like they sought to from 2011 onward. This is what they plan to do with Ukraine. So there is no change with the Trump administration. This is continuity of agenda, and this is their plan to implement it. After U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth delivered this directive to Europe, they immediately began implementing it. A lot of people don't recall or talk about Secretary Hegseth telling Europe that this was the plan. They still honestly believe President Trump wants peace in Ukraine. But after he delivered this directive, Europe began implementing it. And then people who still believe President Trump wants peace, they interpreted this as Europe undermining President Trump's peace negotiations, even though the U.S. told Europe to do this. So we remember right after that, the UK, along with other European nations, announcing a coalition of the willing. This was them getting troops ready to go into Ukraine if a ceasefire was arranged. There was also this: Germany set to spend big on army and infrastructure. This is March, right after February. Germany to comply with Trump's 5% defense spending target, foreign minister suggests. So this is very explicit. President Trump told Europe not 2%, 5%, and Europe began complying. France also, Macron's defense spending plan drives open political divisions in France. And then the most explicit example of this was actually the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey. He literally sat across from the table from Secretary Hegseth in March, about a month after Secretary Hegseth delivered his directive, and this is what he says.
We last met last month in NATO, and then you challenged Europe to step up. You challenged us to step up on Ukraine, on defense spending, on European security, and I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. And last week, the British Prime Minister announced the biggest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, and we will go further.
So absolute obedience from Europe. And so this is not Europe undermining U.S. peace negotiations in Ukraine. This is Europe doing exactly what the U.S. told them to do. Why is there this desperate desire to freeze this conflict? Why is the Trump administration and Europe so insistent on Russia accepting a 30-day unconditional ceasefire? Because that will give them the opportunity to send European troops into Ukraine and make it very difficult for Russia to restart its military operations. Why are they doing that, though? Because as the conflict stands, and just like in Syria before that conflict was frozen, the U.S. is losing it in this proxy war against Russia. And every time morale starts to wane, and there's this need to encourage not just Ukraine, the military, the public, but maintain global support for this U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. They need to convince everybody that no matter how bad things look for Ukraine, Russia is about to collapse. So we always see this narrative rolled out when they need to convince people to just keep fighting a little bit longer. We have this article from the Washington Post. Trump softens on Putin as Russia's military edge weakens. Officials say Moscow's advantage on the Ukraine battlefield is waning, experts say, but President Donald Trump seems disinclined to ramp up pressure on the Kremlin to engage in ceasefire talks. Well, we know that's not true. The U.S. is laundering escalation through Europe. They have Germany taking the limits off these weapons. The U.S. itself obviously made that decision, but they have Germany announce it. So it's public perception management. But the main point of this article is to convince everybody that Russia is weakening. Just keep fighting a little bit longer. Just keep going a little bit longer. This is what the Washington Post says. Absent a negotiated settlement or robust Western assistance, the war probably will continue to slowly trend in Russia's favor through 2025. This is according to a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment presented to Congress 10 days ago by the agency's director. This was from, I believe, May 25th, 2025. But Russia's gains are slowing and continue to come at the expense of high personnel and equipment losses. Since its February 2022 invasion, the DIA assessment said Russia has lost at least 10,000 ground combat vehicles, including more than 3,000 tanks, as well as nearly 250 aircraft and helicopters and more than 10 naval vessels. Over the past year, Russia has taken only 6% of additional Ukrainian territory at the cost of 1,500 killed or wounded per day, current and former Western officials said. Russia is very gradually taking bits of territory still, but at an unsustainably high cost, said Richard Barons, the former head of Britain's Joint Forces Command. Some officials have estimated Russia's total casualties at more than 1 million. But is any of that true? Where's the evidence of any of this? And isn't this what we have been told since the conflict began, that Russia's its military power is going to collapse in a year's time? We've been hearing this since 2022. I've actually have articles like this from Newsweek. Russia might run out of weapons, ammunition by end of year. This is 2022, so by the end of 2022, that they would have run out of weapons and ammunition years ago at this point, in hindsight. And then they publish articles like this. This was just this year. Russia could run out of tanks by 2026. So you can see this is a running narrative that they use to convince people to just keep fighting a little bit longer. It's not futile. Just keep fighting a little bit longer. Russia will eventually collapse. And yet the collapse never quite seems to come. As a matter of fact, as I'm going to demonstrate, because this is as much of an update on military industrial production as it is on the geopolitical aspects of this conflict, I'm going to show you that Russian military industrial production has massively increased. And this is all according to Western sources, not Russian sources. If you look at Western claims of Russian losses, Russian-Ukrainian losses, there's about a 7-to-1 ratio of injured to dead. If we go to Media Zona, this is a US-backed opposition group together with British state media, the BBC, and these are what they call confirmed Russian losses in this conflict. And as you can see, they have a timeline from February 2022 all the way up to May 2025. And as you can see, there is a steep decline in Russian losses. And over the course of a month, you could say that the numbers are still catching up. But this period of time is too long to say that the numbers need to catch up. There's obviously a decline here. And if you look at any given day, there's about 100 to 130, 40, let's be generous and say 150, 100 to 150 confirmed dead, according to this project. Let's just say it's around 100, because there's many days where there's far fewer than 100. Let's say the average is about 100 confirmed dead, according to Media Zona. You take that and times it by 7, that's around 800 total casualties, dead or injured. So it's not even close to 1,500. Let's say, though, that they are losing 1,500 troops every day, dead or injured. That's around 45,000 casualties per month. And yet we have articles like this from the Wall Street Journal. This was from April 27, 2025, so relatively recent. The Russian military moves that have Europe on edge. What does this article say? It says, in recent months, Russia has seen a sharp rise in recruitment because of generous one-time signing bonuses at both the federal and regional levels. The US estimates that around 30,000 Russians are signing up each month, up from about 25,000 last summer. Some Eastern European intelligence officials said the ranks are now swelling by some 40,000 soldiers a month. So 25,000, 30,000, 40,000 a month, not 45,000, not more than 45,000. Yet this is what the Wall Street Journal also says. The extra manpower has allowed the military to rotate new troops in and out of Ukraine and to build new units trained and housed in Russia, according to some European intelligence assessments. That would be impossible if they were losing 45,000 or more casualties every single month, but they were only recruiting 25,000, 30,000, to 40,000 a month. They would not have this additional manpower to rotate troops back and forth from the battlefield, or to create entirely new units and train them extensively inside Russia for long periods of time. That would be impossible, so this is not adding up. Clearly, Russia is not losing that many casualties. As Mediazona itself indicates, there is a decline in casualties. It's not anywhere close to 1,500, and if these recruitment numbers are right and the result of this is additional manpower, a surplus of manpower, then this 1,500 casualty a day claim is wrong. Russia is obviously recruiting more manpower, training more manpower, preparing more manpower than it is losing on the battlefield. What is the same Western media, actually Ukrainian media, saying about Ukrainian manpower levels? Here's from Kiev Independent. This is as pro-Ukrainian as you're gonna get. April 4th, 2025. Inside Ukraine's desperate race to train more soldiers. So right there, already a stark contrast to the manpower situation in Russia, according to the Western media itself. 3 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian military faces an endemic manpower shortage and is forced to scramble for people to fill in the gaps in the infantry depleted by the war. So they're not recruiting and preparing and training more troops than they're losing. Commanders on the ground have said, however, that they're increasingly receiving soldiers who fight as though they have never been trained. I've been talking about this for years. Lacking basic survival skills, such as using an anti-night vision blanket to avoid being spotted by the omnipresent drones, new recruits are often killed or wounded in the first weeks, according to over a dozen officers interviewed across the front line. Ukraine cannot recruit more troops than it is losing on the battlefield. And because they're just barely, or maybe not even replacing their losses, they do not have a surplus of manpower that they can train extensively for long periods of time to actually prepare them for the front line. That is what they are admitting here. And this isn't just depleting manpower. This is also a dive in terms of the quality of these troops. And they admit that they're not properly trained. And it's much worse than just a problem recruiting basic infantry, entry-level infantry, or entry-level artillery, or all of the other roles necessary on the battlefield. They do not have time to even train basic infantry. They do not have time to train all of these other specialties needed for modern warfare. It gets even worse, though. We're talking about officers and non-commissioned officers that provide leadership. Everything from a platoon to a company, all the way up to a brigade. A brigade is about 4,000 troops. At every level, you need to have non-commissioned officers and officers providing leadership, overseeing the different units that make up a brigade. It is units within units within units that makes up a total brigade. And all of these units inside a brigade must fight together, coordinate, conduct combined arms operations. You'll have infantry working with artillery, with drones, with intel, with all of these different aspects required for modern warfare. They all need sufficient training and they need sufficient leadership on the battlefield. And because they cannot even replace basic infantry, they are most certainly incapable of replacing non-commissioned officers and officers who are perishing on the battlefield as well. And I've talked about how papers within the US military talking about standing up a new brigade, and this is if you have a pool of officers to draw from, takes about 2 to 3 years to build a new brigade. Ukraine does not even have those officers to draw from, so it'll take even longer. As a matter of fact, it is impossible for them to reconstitute brigades, and it has been all along. I remember doing videos about Ukraine building up brand new brigades ahead of the 2023 offensive, and I laid all of this out, and I warned people that it is impossible to build up effective brigades in that time frame under those conditions. And of course, after the 2023 offensive, which was completely defeated by Russian defenses, they attempted to reconstitute these brigades because they were devastated by the 2023 offensive. And I warned about how that would be disastrous. And this problem continues to get worse and worse and worse the longer this conflict takes place. And I would say this is their biggest weak point. This is where a collapse is going to happen, probably much more likely than in the case of a shortage of weapons and ammunition, which they are also suffering from. Let's get back to the Washington Post article. They also talked about arms and equipment losses for Russia. They say Russia has lost at least 10,000 ground combat vehicles, including more than 3,000 tanks, as well as nearly 250 aircraft and helicopters, and more than 10 naval vessels. I read that already. And I showed you these articles here where they're always talking about by the end of the year, Russia will be out of armor or missiles or any number of weapons or pieces of equipment. And this is the most recent one. Russia could run out of tanks by 2026 report. And this says the current rate of Russian tank losses in President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine could see them run out of military vehicles by the end of next year, according to International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. And releasing its annual assessment of global military capabilities, the think tank said Russian forces lost about 1,400 main battle tanks in 2024, along with other high losses of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. It also said its report added that Russia has been able to reconstitute some of these losses by relying on stored Soviet legacy equipment, and that in 2024, Moscow's forces have refurbished and built more than 1,500 main battle tanks and around 2,800 infantry fighting vehicles and APCs, armored personnel carriers. However, the equipment in storage is highly likely to be in deteriorated condition, and this may make it hard for Russia to deliver enough equipment to offset previous attrition rates. IISS Director General and Chief Executive Bastian Gregorich said current Russian equipment losses cannot be offset indefinitely by refurbishing stored vehicles. He added that Moscow may not have enough MBTs for its offensive operations beyond 2026. But a lot of this is based on so-called open source intelligence, especially this pro-Ukrainian website. This one, I'm sure everyone is familiar with this, Oryx, and they maintain this. This is a tally of all the weapon systems they claim they've confirmed visually that have been, and you can see it's broken up in categories: destroyed, damaged, captured. That is how they break it down. And I want to focus on T-90M main battle tanks. This is the most modern main battle tank Russia is currently using on the battlefield. And so the same IISS that Newsweek was citing, they're talking about T-90M production. This is actually from June 2024, but this gets across the main idea the Newsweek article is also trying to convey, that they're just not making enough of these tanks. And so what does the IISS say? They're talking about T-90M production. They say this would suggest an increase in annual output from about 40 before February 2022 to a wartime output of 60 to 70 for 2023, with possibly even more to be produced over the course of 2024. Based on this pattern, the production rate from 2025 could be more than 90 main battle tanks, T-90M main battle tanks. If you go back to Oryx, T-90M, how many are destroyed? You just keep looking here until you get to damage. Destroyed, 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 destroyed. This one is damaged. So 83. 83 tanks destroyed. And if you look at some of these pictures, it's hard to tell what condition these tanks are in. Let's just say that one is pretty much destroyed. They have pictures like this. Is that destroyed? Is that completely destroyed? It's hard to tell. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that all of these are destroyed. But I'm just showing you, there are pictures that they say are of destroyed tanks that don't really appear to be destroyed. They're obviously damaged and abandoned. Is that to say they cannot be recovered and refurbished and modernized? I don't know. So out of 136 tank losses, 84 are designated destroyed over the course of 3 years plus. IISS is saying Russia is making 90 tanks a year. So they are actually making more tanks than are being completely destroyed. This 136 tanks lost that we keep hearing cited across the Western media are also including tanks that have been damaged and abandoned, or even captured by Ukraine. Who's to say that Russia hasn't been able to recover many of these tanks? If you follow the Russian Ministry of Defense on Telegram, every week they have videos from repair shops all along the line of contact, recovering and repairing armored vehicles, including T-90 tanks. But even if you looked at this number, 135, and let's pretend all 135 T-90M tanks have been completely destroyed, are irreplaceably lost over the course of 3 years, that accounts for about 45 tanks per year. And IISS, a Western think tank, is saying Russia is making 90 new, brand new, from scratch T-90M main battle tanks. That's twice as many as they are losing. People could make the argument, well, Russia is ahead of the curve for T-90M main battle tanks, but that's because they used so many T-72s, different variants of T-72s. There's also T-80s that they are refurbishing and modernizing, and so these are also being lost, but they cannot be replaced once the Soviet era stockpiles of old tank hulls and turrets run out. I don't think that it's a viable argument. So there's that. We also hear a lot of Western analysts claim videos of Russians carrying out assaults using motorcycles or all-terrain vehicles like four-wheelers, side-by-sides, which are basically an off-road golf cart sort of vehicle. It could be electric, could be gas-powered. They're claiming Russians are using that because they're already out of armor. So they can't even make up their mind whether they're going to run out of armor next year or they're already out of armor. And the reality is Russia and Ukraine, they carry out assaults like this because using smaller, quieter, faster vehicles for these assaults make it much less likely they'll be detected and makes it much harder for swarms of drones to target and destroy them while conducting these assaults. So an armored vehicle is much larger, it's louder, it's easier to detect, it's moving slower, and it's easier to engage with drones and other types of anti-tank weapons. So a lot of this is already not adding up. Out of all of the arguments the collective West makes, I would say their argument regarding armor is probably the most convincing. After armor, it gets worse and worse for Ukraine and its Western sponsors. What about other capabilities? They talk about armor, but the vast majority of casualties on the battlefield are from artillery and drones. They make up a significant portion of casualties on both sides. I've talked about artillery shell production for years and years now. I've been explaining why Russia has consistently outproduced both the US and Europe combined. And despite claims that the West would drastically expand production, they have fallen far short of that. Let's do an update on that. This is Business Insider. This is an article from this year, April 4th, 2025. Russia on track to build artillery shell stockpile, triple the size of the US's and Europe's combined. Top US generals. Notice none of my sources are Russian. This is all Western media citing Western sources. What does this article say? It says, Russia may be losing weapons, tanks, and ammo at a staggering pace in Ukraine. That is debatable. But its defense production is going to easily make up for it. A top U.S. general told Congress, U.S. Army General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, told the Senate Armed Service Committee that Washington expects Russia to produce 250,000 artillery shells monthly, which puts it on track to build a stockpile 3 times greater than the United States and Europe combined. That is this year, 2025. They're talking about this year. And I've talked about the reason why the West cannot compete with Russia, because Russia's military industrial base is comprised of state-owned enterprises. The state tells them what is needed and they produce it, whether there's profit or not. Their primary objective is to fulfill the needs of the state. Across the West, military industrial base is comprised of private corporations that seek first and foremost to profit. And if it's not profitable, they're not interested in doing it. I'll give you an example of how this affects shell production specifically. This is the war zone shell game inside the worldwide TNT shortage. This was from May 12th, 2025. And it's an interview with Johnny Summers, Vice President of Energetics for Global Ordnance. This is a company that makes 155 and 152 millimeter artillery shells. And he's talking about the explosives in the shell itself and the propellant needed to launch it out of an artillery piece. So they're talking about TNT. China is offering TNT around the world, and we get offered it 1 or 2 times a week from various brokers that approach us. We're not allowed to procure that TNT from China, so we don't. Thank you very much. We're looking at other sources in other countries. I don't want to divulge too much at this point, but we are in negotiations with a couple of other factories in other countries that aren't on the banned list, where we can potentially bring in TNT for both the US government and for our commercial customers. When you need to expand production, and expanding production could take a year or more to actually do, but you're still in negotiations to actually procure input material for production, that means Ukraine is not going to get these shells anytime in the foreseeable future. What about propellant? This requires nitrocellulose. This is what he says when he's asked about the propellant. China makes that as well in large quantities. We've got a contract to procure some from Taiwan, which is part of China, by the way. There's also a factory in Brazil. Most of these factories that exist don't do high volume. We work with a propellant manufacturer in Canada, and their annual requirement for propellant is about 5,000 metric tons. So that's a lot of nitrocellulose. But they're saying that is the problem. They need to source it overseas. They're asked whether or not they're going to make a production plant themselves to make these input materials, vertically integrate their operation. And they said, no, it doesn't make any business sense to do that. It's expensive, it's difficult, there's all kinds of regulations and red tape, and we're not interested in doing that. That is the problem with leaving this to private corporations that prioritize profit over any sort of purpose, when profit is their purpose. A state-owned enterprise is going to create a massive production facility. They're going to keep manpower on hand, even if production decreases. They're going to keep equipment, tooling on hand, even if it's not being used. They're going to keep it in case the state needs to surge production for national security, not for profit, even if it means losing money in the process. Private corporation in the West is going to look at excess production capacity and say, that is a waste of space, time, and money. We are cutting it to maximize profits. They're going to look at vertical integration and say it's too difficult to do that here in the United States. It's cheaper and more profitable to outsource it overseas. So this is what they have done. And now they're in the process of trying to undo it, and they won't even undo it because it's not profitable. The link to this interview is in the video description below. You could read the entire interview and draw your own conclusions. Let's get back to the Business Insider article talking about shell production. It says the US now makes about 40,000 155 millimeter artillery shells a month and hopes to reach a monthly production capacity of 90,000 rounds in 2026. So not this year, next year, sometime next year. Meanwhile, the European Union has pledged to hit a manufacturing capacity of 2 million rounds a year, or about 165,000 rounds a month. However, its leaders have estimated it will only reach that level by the end of 2025. Many of these rounds are being sent to Ukraine, though NATO countries are also concerned about maintaining their own stockpiles. Should Ukraine receive 2 million shells a year, it can fire just 5,000 a day. Cavoli, meanwhile, said at the defense conference in February 2023 that Russia was expending 20,000 shells a day on average. Well, that was in 2023. If they're making 250,000 rounds a month themselves, we're also told they're receiving artillery shells from North Korea. We don't know how many exactly, but at a minimum, around 8,000, 8,500 shells could be fired per day by Russia now. That is still more than Ukraine will be able to fire per day if and when the US and Europe both reach their production goals sometime in the future, this year or next year. And that's if by next year, the end of this year or next year, Russia hasn't increased artillery shell production even further. Now, the argument you will hear is that Ukraine doesn't have artillery, but they're making drones instead. They have this huge advantage in drone technology, and they're using these drones to compensate for a lack of artillery. That this isn't true, and it also doesn't even make sense when you really think about it. Both Ukraine and Russia have huge numbers of drones. So it's not as if Ukraine has drones and Russia does not. They both have drones, and depending on what source in the West you listen to, they describe about a comparable number of drones being produced on both sides. So that Ukraine really doesn't have an advantage. Often we hear, well, it's not an advantage in numbers, it's an advantage in capability and in terms of the training of Ukrainian drone operators. But if we go back to the manpower issue, they can't even train basic infantry. So where are they getting these drone operators from? None of it adds up. But back in reality, Ukraine is using their drones to compensate for artillery, but also for all of the things you need to actually use drones for. Russia has drones to use for everything you need to use drones for, plus they also have more artillery at their disposal. So they have the obvious advantage in both areas. But it turns out, according to the Western media, that no, Ukraine actually does not have an advantage in drones. This was never true, but it's a narrative that has persisted. But the Western media, even now, is admitting that no, they don't have an advantage. So this is May 23rd, 2025. This is earlier this week. Washington Post, Ukraine scrambles to overcome Russia's edge in fiber optic drones. Ukraine pioneered the use of small drones on the battlefield, but in Russia's Kursk region, Moscow's fiber optic cables helped turn the tide. New drones were swarming the battlefield and didn't rely on jammable radio signals like the older, simpler models. These were controlled instead by tiny cables as thin as thread stretching back to the operator. So usually you're using some sort of radio signal to control a drone. If you're using a radio signal, electronic warfare can disrupt that signal. It can commandeer the drone, or it could disrupt the signal so you're no longer able to communicate with the drone. The drone just sits there or falls out of the sky, depending on how it was designed. With a wire guiding the drone, there is no way to use electronic warfare to interfere with the signal. It's going through the wire directly to the operator. This is how anti-tank guided missiles, wire-guided anti-tank missiles actually work. They're now using that concept with drone warfare. For months, Russia has ramped up its deployment of fiber optic drones, which are steered by the same data transporting cables made of glass that revolutionized high-speed internet access. While the cables can occasionally tangle, cutting off the signal, they also give the weapon a major advantage because they cannot be disrupted by jamming signals. Russian troops have used the weapons, which have a range of up to 12 miles or 19 kilometers for the rest of the world, to destroy Ukrainian equipment and control key logistic routes, particularly in Russia's western Kursk region, where Ukrainian troops say the new technology contributed to their recent painful retreat. That and many, many other factors. The manpower issue, obviously. And again, going back to my older videos covering the conflict in Ukraine, again, the Western media, even Ukraine itself, admitted this incursion into Kursk drew some of the best manpower and equipment from Ukraine's armed forces away from the line of contact, weakening the entire line of contact and compounding all of Ukraine's problems. The article continues, it says, Russia's fiber optic drones, which have a longer battery life and more precise targeting than wireless models, vastly outnumbered Ukraine's drones on the battlefield in Kursk, giving Russia a key advantage in making movements so risky that Ukrainian troops were at times stranded on the front line without food, ammunition, or escape routes, soldiers said. Ukraine is also using fiber optic drones in Kursk and everywhere, though in significantly smaller numbers, as it races to catch up with Russia's mass production of the devices in what soldiers and experts describe as the first time Russia has surpassed Ukraine in frontline drone technology since the full-scale invasion in 2022. But that isn't true. If it was true, you would have seen some sort of manifestation of this advantage they always claim Ukraine had. They've never had any sort of overwhelming advantage on the battlefield. The only time they had any sort of actual advantage was in 2022, because Russia did not commit nearly enough troops to hold all of the territory they initially seized, which is why we saw the Kherson and Kharkov offensive succeed against Russian forces. They just withdrew because they knew they didn't have the ability to hold all that territory. They retreated to the amount of territory that number of troops could sustainably defend. And since then, Ukraine has held no advantage over Russia in any regard. The same article is talking about Ukrainians making drones in these workshops that are distributed all across the country. They're more difficult to find and target than, say, a large factory mass-producing drones. And a lot of these workshops work specifically for one unit. One specific military unit has a workshop making drones custom tailored for its needs. And they always claim that this is some sort of advantage Ukraine has, except Russia also has these types of workshops attached to specific units. They also have massive factories producing huge numbers of drones of all kinds. This is the Garan 2. And if you look at different sources, 2024, 2025, they should have reached about 6,000 Garan 2 drones per year, possibly more. That's why in recent weeks and months, we have seen larger and larger swarms of Garan 2 drones. Recent attack targeting Ukraine is said to have consisted of just one single attack consisted of up to 500 Garan 2 drones. So now, Ukraine does not have an advantage in terms of drones, not in quantity, not in quality or capability. They do not have an advantage in terms of manpower. Admittedly, they do not have an advantage, nor will they ever have an advantage in artillery fire, not as things are now. You have a front line. You have troops on both sides. Russia has more drones, more artillery to strike at the front line and to the rear of the front line, the logistics supporting the front line. What about even longer range weapon systems? Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. I just talked about the Garan 2 drone. That is also a very long range weapon. Who has the advantage there? Again, it is Russia, and this is according to the Western media. This is a report published earlier this year, 2025, Tactical Developments during the third year of the Russo-Ukrainian War. And it says Russia is currently set to produce in 2025 more than 750 Iskander ballistic missiles, more than 560 Kh-101 cruise missiles, according to plans drawn up by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Ballistic missiles and cruise missiles is another area of obvious advantage for Russia. Again, the Western media admits all of this. Let's not even count Garan 2 drones, or let's not talk about cruise missiles yet. Let's just talk about the Iskander ballistic missile. Russia is saying 750 per year. Other sources say around 600 to 650. The only missile that I'm aware of capable, in theory, of intercepting an Iskander ballistic missile is the Patriot missile system. This is the only air defense system that was transferred in large numbers to Ukraine that is capable of possibly intercepting Iskander missiles. If Russia is producing somewhere between 600 to 750 missiles a year, is Ukraine receiving enough Patriot missile interceptors to intercept them all? Is Lockheed Martin, which produces the Patriot missile interceptor, are they making enough worldwide to intercept this number of Iskander ballistic missiles? And the answer is no. And this is according to Lockheed Martin itself. This is from March 24th, 2025. Lockheed Martin's PAC-3 achieves record production year. How many are they producing? It says in October 2024, the U.S. Army awarded Lockheed Martin a contract to increase production capacity to 650 PAC-3 MSEs per year. Lockheed Martin is expected to reach 650 by the year 2027. Let's just say they had 650 missiles right now. That is 100 missiles short if Russia is correct and Russia is producing 750 Iskanders per year. It's 100 missiles short, and that's assuming every single Patriot interceptor is sent to Ukraine, which is not true, which is not happening and will not happen. But let's just say that somehow that was possible. Every single Patriot missile interceptor was sent to Ukraine. That is not enough to intercept all the Iskander missiles Russia is producing, even if these missiles had a 100% success rate with just one shot, which they don't. And if you watch videos of Patriot missile systems themselves coming under attack from Iskander or Kinjal, which is a modified air-launched version of the Iskander, which reaches hypersonic speeds, you will see the Patriot missile system launches every missile that is available. It will launch every single missile in an attempt to intercept these incoming Iskander or Kinjal missiles, and they still often miss. It usually takes 2 to 3 interceptors to intercept any incoming target, whether it's a cruise missile, a drone, or a ballistic missile, especially a ballistic missile. So Ukraine will never have enough Patriot missile systems or missile interceptors to protect itself from this huge number and growing number of Iskander ballistic missiles. What about, people will say, what about NASAMS? NASAMS have the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile. These are not capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. They are supposed to intercept aircraft, drones, and cruise missiles. What about AIM-120 AMRAAM annual production versus Russia's production of cruise missiles and drones? Let's look at this article from Breaking Defense. Raytheon to max out AMRAAM production for foreseeable future. This was September 2023, but foreseeable future, I think we could say, covers 2024, 2025. Let's see what the article says. Ukraine has been hungry for the missiles to bat down a range of airborne threats, from aircraft to cruise missiles, and obviously drones. Built as air-to-air missiles, Kiev has primarily used AMRAAMs with the ground-based National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, NASAMS, also made by Raytheon through though the impending transfer of F-16s means AMRAAMs could soon be fired from Ukrainian aircraft as well. Historically, we've been somewhere between 500 to 800 rounds a year, said Paul Ferraro, president of Air Power for RTX subsidiary Raytheon, during a briefing with reporters. Current orders have ramped that number up to nearly 1,200, Ferraro said, hitting the company's ceiling for the missiles production and giving current demand. Ferraro said he expects that level of production to continue for the foreseeable future. So 1,200 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles every single year. Rusi says Russia is making just 560 KH-101 cruise missiles alone, plus 6,000 Garan-2 drones. And then we have this article from Army Recognition. Ukrainian intelligence reveals Russia's missile production surge despite sanctions, because there's many other types of cruise missiles Russia manufactures other than the KH-101. And this is citing Andrei Yusov, a representative of Ukraine's defense intelligence. This was shared at the end of last year. According to him, Russia produces between 40 and 50 Iskander missiles, 30 to 50 caliber missiles, and approximately 50 KH-101 missiles each month. These figures indicate a steady increase in manufacturing capacity over the year. 360 to 600 caliber cruise missiles, together with 600 KH-101 cruise missiles, is already somewhere between 960 to 1,200 cruise missiles, plus the 6,000 plus Garan-2 drones Russia manufactures each year. And again, you cannot compare the number of AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles produced, 1,200, to the number of incoming targets on a one-to-one basis. Usually two or more missiles will be required to ensure these incoming targets are successfully intercepted. And that, again, is assuming that all 1,200 of these missiles are going to Ukraine, which they never will. A small number of them from that number will go to Ukraine. So again, it is impossible for Ukraine's air defense network to intercept all of these incoming missiles and drones from Russia. And this has an accumulative effect over time. It is wearing down the number of interceptors available, is also targeting and destroying the air defense systems themselves. NASAMS, Germany's IRIS-T system, the Patriot missile system. We've watched numbers of these launchers and radars being destroyed. The Pentagon itself admitted a Patriot missile battery was damaged in 2023. A Kinjal missile, it failed to intercept. We remember that video. The Patriot missile system launched every single missile it had available, and it still missed. So this is the problem Ukraine has. This is the problem the collective West has in terms of modern military capabilities. The rest of the world has not just caught up because they are employing state-owned enterprises to oversee military-industrial production. They have vastly surpassed the collective West. The West's ambitions far exceed its capability of achieving them, at least through military power. Remember, they also have many asymmetric means of pursuing their objectives successfully. Just always keep in mind Syria. That is always a reminder that military power alone is not necessary for the US to succeed. And I'm only talking about ballistic and cruise missiles. I haven't even really talked about hypersonic missiles. The Zircon or the Kinjal air-launched hypersonic missile hasn't been used for months now. And I came across this. Article from Euromaidan Press, again, as pro-Ukrainian as is possible. Russian MiG-31K carrying Kinjal missiles absent from Ukrainian skies for 3 weeks. And this was this was February 2025. We still have not seen MiG-31 Kinjal strikes since then. And the BBC News Russian speculates that the aircraft may have exhausted their service life, but then it also cites Ukrainian officials who say they don't believe that. They believe Russia is stockpiling these Kinjal hypersonic missiles. The reason why is because Ukraine's air defense system has collapsed. They are incapable of successfully intercepting ordinary Iskander ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. There's no reason to use this much more capable Kinjal missile. You should stockpile them and save them for circumstances that actually absolutely require them. You use hypersonic missiles to circumvent capable air defense systems. Russia's pause on using the Kinjal hypersonic missile is another indicator that Ukraine's air defenses have collapsed. So when you look at all of these different areas, manpower, drones, artillery, air defenses, the lack of any significant long-range strike capability of its own to strike back at Russia in regards to cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. All of this adds up to a severe deficit against Ukraine. We're always hearing about how little territory Russia is gaining, but we have to remember, Russia is not fighting a war of territorial conquest. Right now, they are fighting a war of attrition. They are trying to grind down and hollow out Ukraine to precipitate a collapse. They're not trying to break through positions. They're wearing them down, and as they give, as they crumble, they're moving forward. There's a big difference between the two. And even still, as Ukraine's fighting capacity gradually collapses over time, we are seeing gains in Russian territorial possession. So right here, this was the New York Times, October 2024. And you can see how the initial incursion, the amount of territory taken, the amount of territory Ukraine took back in its different offensives. And then this isn't a linear, but an exponential increase in territory taken. And this is amid a war of attrition, not a war of territorial gain. What happens when Ukrainian manpower, arms and ammunition, can no longer even just hold the line? We are going to see additional territorial gains. People constantly ask me, when will Russia launch a big arrow offensive? There's no reason for them to do that. It would be costly. The outcome would be uncertain. At a time when attrition is already having the desired effect. It is just like the conflict in Syria, which was frozen for years and years, but because of the US's ability and the ability of its proxies to hollow out Syria, eventually there was a complete collapse. And the entire country was captured in less than a month. Very rapidly, over the course of 1 or 2 weeks. The whole country was captured, basically. That is the type of scenario that Ukraine could potentially face. At the culmination of this war of attrition, Russia is launching. This is what the Trump administration, what the special interests he works for, fear the most. In that case, there is nothing to freeze in Ukraine. The US has just simply lost in Ukraine. And then it will have to still deal with the rise of China, and it will still have to find a way to deal with, to pin down and overextend Russia as it focuses on Iran and China and North Korea elsewhere. It's a multi-front conflict the US is waging to maintain its global primacy. It does not seek to wage war against all of these countries at the same time. It wants to freeze them, overextend others, focus on just one, defeat them in detail, rather than try to fight them all at once. That is the plan. That was always the plan. That was the plan before President Trump stepped foot in office. This is the plan he is obviously implementing, regardless of the rhetoric, the back and forth rhetoric that comes from him and others in his administration. The people he surrounded himself with are people who work for the interests funding these think tanks that have articulated these policies. They themselves are repeating almost verbatim, like US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth did in February. That directive he laid out in February is visibly what is now taking shape. Everything else was a distraction. Everything else was to manage public perception, to make it appear as if President Trump really did try for peace, and it was others who undermined him. He himself now on social media is blaming everyone except himself. It all goes back to the fact that this is a US war on Russia, fought through not just Ukraine, but also Europe. If the US really wanted to, it really could have ended this conflict overnight. It could have pulled the plug and everything would have ended. The fact that it hasn't is because the US and those in the US government right now do not want it to end. They just wanted to convince some people that they did want it to end. We have to keep a very close eye on the conflict in Ukraine. We also have to keep a very close eye on the overall geopolitical situation. As the policy papers themselves admit, this is not just about Ukraine and Russia. This is about a global strategy of division of labor and strategic sequencing. Not just Russia, but also China, primarily, but also Iran and North Korea. We have to remember that even with all the advantages Russia and China have militarily over the United States, the US has a vast array of asymmetric means at its disposal that it has used successfully in recent history, Syria being a very important example to keep in mind. So we have to keep an eye on what is going on in Ukraine together with all of these other factors. They all are interrelated, and the outcome of any one of them is going to affect the other. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this and reporting it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Everything that I referenced in this video is listed in the video description below. You can check out those articles and read them for yourself. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them because they're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Again, the links to both of those platforms is in the video description below. To everybody who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or even if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what allows me to continue doing this work. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.